personal endurance. About 2 o'clock or so this afternoon, all the Google networks crashed, and I do all of my preparation on Google Slides and on Google Docs, and then transfer it and move it around and send it to the church's computer and all that, and it all went down, and so it was kind of glitchy for a while, and I was able to kind of figure out the way to work through the glitches. I was feeling all good about it, and then whenever I got ready to download it, it said, will not download, and then everybody started complaining online, oh no, it's gone down. So if you do your homework that's to be turned in at school on that program, do not wait till the last minute, or maybe if you're preparing a sermon slides, don't wait till the last minute. But I think I have it all put together. If something kind of messes up here, we'll be able to figure it out. Okay, let's go with the first slide. There we go. We got the glitch going already. I see, right there. All right. We got it? Because they're supposed to look at a picture. There we go. Okay. So what can you, look real closely, what can you see in this picture?
Two cats.
Okay. Most people, almost without exception, ignore everything in the picture except the cats. They see the cats. That's what they say. Oh, there they are, 2 cats. But you know what I wanted you to see was the flowers, not the cats. But you didn't notice those. I mean, you did, but you just kind of didn't point out. You noticed the flowers? Good for you. But, I mean, you knew they were there. I get that. You knew the flowers were there. You saw them. But just with this general question, what can you see in the picture? You didn't mention the green grass or the fence, but instead it was the cats. I think sometimes in our Bible study, sometimes we miss out on things because we aren't looking for all that can be gleaned or all can be gained from Scripture. And I thought tonight it might be good for us, as we're thinking and studying about David, to look at 2 people who had a profound impact upon David's life. They are King Saul and Jonathan. And both of these men, almost from opposite ends, had a profound effect upon David, especially at the beginning. And we're going to look at each one of them as each one kind of pulled from a different direction. Saul, consumed by jealousy, and Jonathan, consumed by love and friendship and unselfishness. Both of them involved in David's life almost as if coming from 2 different sides, as if it's 2 voices speaking in his ear. One to discourage and to harass him and to send him hiding out in caves, and the other to encourage him, to let him know it's going to be okay, and to let him know, even though I'm supposed to be king, I know it's going to be you. And I love you. We will not overlook the profound effect then that these 2 had upon David's life. They tested his faith, and they also helped to build it. So as we think about Saul then, we're going to look at it in terms of jealousy, the destructive progression of jealousy. We're going to see we're going to see Saul and how that Saul deteriorates as a man who God chose from among the people to be God's leader, king, and how he disintegrates before our eyes in jealousy, and Jonathan in the beautiful progression of a loving friendship. Now, we're going to use our Bibles a lot tonight. We're going to read some, so if you take your Bibles out on Sunday nights, we're able to do a little deeper looking. So turn first to 1 Samuel chapter 18. We'll be introduced to both of these people who had this impact upon David's life. First 12 verses. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. And from that day Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe that he was wearing. He gave it to David along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it successfully. Saul gave him a high rank in the army, and this pleased all the people and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with tambourines and lutes. And as they danced, they sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." And Saul was very angry. This refrain galled him. "They have credited David with tens of thousands," he thought, "but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom?" And from that time, Saul kept a jealous eye on David, it says here in the NIV. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcibly upon Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the harp, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had left Saul. Now, I believe in these verses we can find some information that will show us this spiraling downward and the progression of jealousy. Let's go to the next slide. And here they are: anger, suspicion, violence, this spiritual emptiness and fear that we'll find that was there in those last verses. And then for most of the rest of the story of Saul and David, we find this great obsession, this almost out of his mind obsession that Saul has in trying to capture David, to kill David, to harass him, to arrest him. Let's look at these different progressions now of jealousy. First is anger. Let's read these verses that I've put here. 1 Samuel 18 and verse 8. Saul was very angry with this refrain, and it galled him. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but with me only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? So here almost immediately in this relationship, the jealousy that Saul has toward the fame of David makes him angry. Now when we come to Jonathan, Jonathan is going to be happy that his friend has recognition. Let's go to the next slide now. In 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 30, Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and he said to him, now this is later on in the story, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you?" You know, anger can be a big problem among us. Anger can make us say things we shouldn't say. Anger can make us think things we shouldn't think. In James chapter 1 and verses 19 and 20, James writes, "Dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires." Now, we're just going to look at these briefly tonight because there are so many of them. Secondly, suspicion. As I read from verse 9, and from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Now he was going to watch after him. He was angry, and he was suspicious of him, and he was going to keep an eye on him. Now, there was a FoxNews.com study from 2013, and it was of women and jealousy, and this is what they said. "Once you're green-eyed, you might have trouble seeing anything else. Quite literally, a study found that women in the throes of jealousy had trouble spotting obvious objects. The greater their jealousy, the harder time they had. Note to self, no driving while jealous." But the idea was that when a person was jealous, it was so consuming of them that they almost lost sight of the world around them because all they were focused on was this jealous object, whatever it was. Now, I'm not just picking on women here. That happened to be the subjects in the study. It would be true to everyone. In 1 Corinthians 3, in verse 3, Paul, in speaking to the Corinthian church about the jealousy among them, said, "Are you still worldly? For since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere humans?" Well, it doesn't stop there with Saul. Saul then, in his jealousy of David, turns his suspicion into violence. As we read there in verse 10, an evil spirit of God came forcibly upon Saul. We'll discuss what that means in another lesson. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the harp, as he usually did. And Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice. David remains calm and respectful towards Saul despite the king's growing hostility and repeated attempts to kill him. There's another time, which we won't read about, that I have here in this commentator, that Saul sent David off to obtain 200 foreskins of Philistines in exchange for his daughter Michal's hand in marriage, hoping that David would be killed, and it didn't happen. So there were many attempts to where Saul's intentions, because of his jealousy, became violent. Number 4, spiritual emptiness and fear. Here we have these 3 examples, verse 12, 15, and 29. Verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but he had departed from Saul. If you remember in this morning's lesson, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David, and we talked about a little bit what that meant for him. But here we find that because of Saul's disobedience, because of his unwillingness to follow the directions of God that were given by Samuel to him, that God had left him. His spirit had departed from him. And so the jealousy then led to such rebellion against God that God's spirit left him. How tragic. In verse 15, when Saul saw how successful he was, that is David, he was afraid of him. And in verse 29, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. Can you not see how jealousy, if left unchecked, can become something very ugly? And finally, then, in this last and greatest section, we find that this jealousy became a complete obsession for Saul. Let's turn your Bibles to verse 1 of chapter 19. Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan was very fond of David and warned him, "My father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on guard tomorrow morning." If you look over in chapter 24, we have a very wonderful story where David returns good for evil. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, "David is in the desert of En-Gedi." So Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way, and a cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself, and David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, "This is the very day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, 'I will give you your enemies into your hands for you to deal with as you wish.'" Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Now, we won't read this, but later David is grieved that he even did that. After David was conscience-stricken for having cut off the corner of his robe, he said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift a hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." And with these words, David rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul, and Saul left the cave and went his way. And David went out to the edge of the cave and called out, "My lord the king!" When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself in the face to the ground and said to Saul, "Why do you listen when men say David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lift my hand against my master because he is the Lord's anointed." So here we find this wonderful scene where David returns good for evil. The profound impact of fleeing from Saul for all this time must have played a really heavy toll upon David. Let's go back to one slide, to the Psalm 1. All of these Psalms, these 6 different Psalms, especially the ones I have the X's by for sure, they all relate to David's feelings while he's being pursued by Saul. Let's take a look at the one in the middle there, Psalm 59, for a moment. Psalm 59. It's really great that in some of the Psalms we have the little heading that's above them that tells you the event that brought about the psalm. So this one says, "For the director of music, to the tune of Do Not Destroy of David, when Saul had sent men to watch David's house in order to kill him." If you look over in Psalm 57, it says, "For the director of music, to the tune of Do Not Destroy of David, when he had fled from Saul into the cave." So these are the events then in David at the time when he's fleeing from Saul. And here is part of the psalm. "Deliver me from my enemies, O God. Protect me from those who rise up against me. Deliver me from evildoers and save me from bloodthirsty men. See how they lie in wait for me. Fierce men conspire against me. For no offense or sin of mine, O Lord. I've done no wrong, yet they are ready to attack me. Arise and help me. Look on my plight, O Lord, my Almighty, the God of Israel. Rouse yourself to punish the nations. Show no mercy to the wicked traitors." And you can get more flavor of it. And these others that are there too. So this was really a heavy thing for David. They almost sound depressed in a way. Parts of them do. Where David is living in caves. He's hiding out. He's running from Saul. And now, as we think about David's good heart, and then we'll move on to Jonathan, David's good heart is revealed in his response to Saul's jealousy. He returns good for evil. He has a lasting respect for God's anointed. God anointed Saul to be king, and David respected that. No matter how bad Saul became, no matter how corrupt, no matter how evil, he realized this is a man that God chose, and the holy oil of God has been placed upon him, and I will not hurt him. And then his forgiveness of Saul. In contrast to Saul, then, Jonathan stands as an example of non-jealousy. One whose love for David outweighs his own political power. His love that outweighs his rightful ascension to the combined throne of Judah and Israel. He's pretty remarkable when you think about the selflessness that Jonathan has in his relationship to David. So let's consider these. Don't be alarmed by how long this list is. We won't spend too much time on them. But I want you to see the beauty of the progression of a loving friendship. It stands as a bookend to jealousy. One side, the jealousy of Jonathan's father toward David, and on this side, the beautiful progression of a loving friendship. And we're going to see that love is unjealous. Love is committed. Love rejoices in the success of another. Love is protective. It is intimate. And it is less interested in personal recognition and power. What does that list sound familiar to? What does it sound close to? It sounds very much like 1 Corinthians 13, doesn't it? And we'll look at that in a little while. So first, let's consider love is unjealous. Back to 1 Samuel chapter 18. I tell you, we're not going to read that again because that's what we read a few moments ago. Love is unjealous. Let's see just a second. Look at these gifts here in chapter 18 and verse 3. We won't read it, but he gave his robe to David. He gave his tunic to David. He gave his sword to David. He gave his bow to David. And he gave his belt to David. Love is committed. We will read these. 1 Samuel 19 up through verse 3, and then we'll read from chapter 20. Saul told his son Jonathan and all of his attendants to kill David, but Jonathan was very fond of David and warned him, "My father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there, and I will go out and stand with my father in the field where you are, and I will speak to him about you, and I will tell you what I find out." Let's look also in chapter 20, verses 16 and 17. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord call David's enemies into account." And Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him, because he loved him as he loved himself. So it was a very committed friendship, a very committed love that they had between the two of them. Number 3 in this list, love rejoices in the success of another. So back in chapter 19, whenever Saul is complaining about Jonathan's loyalty to David, Jonathan reminds him of the success that David has brought to the kingdom, verses 4 through 6. Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul, his father, and said to him, "Let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what has he done, or what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands and has killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason?" And Saul listened to Jonathan and took his oath, "As sure as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death." Of course, Saul doesn't follow through with that. But here we find Jonathan, he's not jealous. He's committed to David. And as David has success, he isn't jealous of the success. I think that's really difficult for us human beings. I think it's very easy for me, if I don't keep it in check, probably for many of us, to fail to rejoice in the successes of others because we wish the successes were our own. And so if someone else gets acclaimed at school or at work or gets rewarded for the things that they have done and accomplished, if we aren't careful, rather than rejoice with that person, we can become jealous of them instead. And here, Jonathan has just this amazing attitude, and he's happy at the success of his friend. If you look in chapter 20, we'll see how love is protective. Love is protective. Chapter 20, verses 1 through 4. Then David fled from Naioth to Ramah and went to Jonathan and asked, "What have I done? What is my crime? How have I wronged your father that he's trying to take my life?" "Never," Jonathan replied. "You're not going to die. Look, my father doesn't do anything great or small without confiding in me. Why would he hide this from me? It's not so." But David took an oath and said, "Your father knows very well that I have found favor in your eyes." And he has said to himself, "Jonathan must not know this, or he will be grieved. Yet as surely as the Lord lives, and as surely as you live, there is only a step between me and death." And Jonathan said to David, "Whatever you want me to do, I will do for you." Now this is the storyline of the arrows that are shot if you remember that, to where the arrows are shot in order for David to know whether or not Saul was trying to kill him. Of course, Jonathan is grieved because on this occasion, he finds out his father's true intentions. Here's then the list of in 1 Corinthians 13 that sounds very familiar to what we're studying. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrong. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. This relationship then between David and Jonathan shows us a wonderful example of a true friendship, a loving friendship. I think there's also an element between these two men that is close and intimate. If you look in verse 41 of chapter 20, after the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever.'" Then David left, and Jonathan went back to town. In the first part of 2 Samuel in chapter 1, when Jonathan is killed and David laments over the death, we find these words: "I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother, for you were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war have perished." So there's something very special between these two men. They were very close. They had a great friendship. Finally, in this section, love is less interested in personal recognition and power. This time, chapter 23. Let me see if I have that for you. Yeah, I have it on a slide. "Don't be afraid," he said. "My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this." The two of them made a covenant before the Lord, and then Jonathan went home, but David remained at Horish. Jonathan thought that David would be king and he'd be his right-hand man, that he'd be his friend, that they would rule together. Again, think of the attitude. You know, it's hard for us in this century to be able to put ourselves in the mind of a ruling class of people in ancient times. Jonathan, by his birthright, was supposed to be king. He was the son of the king. But yet he finds a way to rejoice in the fact that his best friend is going to be king and he'll serve him. It's a wonderful attitude. I like what this commentator says. Jonathan's love for David was more wonderful than that of women, perhaps because the degree of devotion between men was and is in this way kind of unusual. Men often have difficulty in expressing their deepest feelings, but here are two manly men, valiant, honest warriors, and decent people who are not afraid to declare their love for each other. It's a beautiful thing. Simply put, then, if we pull all this together, tonight's lesson can be boiled down to one enduring principle: selfishness. Jealousy is selfish. It's about me. The recognition I don't get. The attention I don't get. The things I don't have. But love is about unselfishness. It's rejoicing in what you can do. It's rejoicing in what you have. It's rejoicing in what you can accomplish. Here then, these two impactful people in David's life, jealousy selfishness and love and unselfishness. Selfishness, if you think about it, is truly at the root of most sin. I remember Susan and I asking one of her sisters one time when our kids were little, we were talking about raising your children and everything. And she said to Susan, I was there too, she said, if you think about it, most sin and the hurt in relationships boils down to selfishness. It's about me doing what I want to do, the way I want to do it, without thinking about you and how it affects you. So may we cultivate unselfish hearts. It's really a joy to look at David, to think about his life, to see how he truly does rise above the others. And although the Bible says of Saul that he stood a head taller than everyone else, I think in reality, it's David who stood a head taller than everyone else. Not because he was a tall man, but because he was a big man in God's sight. If you'd like to respond tonight, the invitation is yours as we stand and sing.